Hey, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Patricia Ellingwood. I am the General Manager of the Ontario Forage Council. I'd like to thank our mentors tonight for joining us, Steve Martin, Birgit Martin, Joe Dickenson, and Chris Moore. And we we assume that you know them pretty good by now, but if you don't, their bios are on our website, onforagenetwork.ca, and you can read about more about them there on the Advanced Grazing Mentorship page. I am not going to waste any more time talking. I'm going to turn things right over to Steve Martin to get us started with our first presentation.
Thank you, Patricia. Yes, my name is Steve Martin. I'm a rotational grazer in Dufferin County, and tonight I'm going to start the conversation with you about fall grazing look ahead. As we get into the fall season, there's lots of opportunities to continue grazing, and I'm going to take a look at a few of those options for us. So first, I'm going to cover two topics. We're going to start with taking a look at a grazing plan and chart, as these tools can be very useful while grazing throughout the season. And then I'm going to give you several things to consider before you start grazing cover crops, whenever that may be. Okay, so the grazing plan and chart can be very intimidating to start using. So we're going to start this evening by going over what we are looking at with the grazing plan and the grazing chart. Then once we know what we are looking at, we just need to start using it. This tool is very helpful to anyone trying to rotationally graze, whether grazing pasture, cover crops, or even hay fields. I can't stress enough how important it is to just start using one. Because once you start using it, the information it can provide is very valuable for decision making. So the last thing we will touch on with the grazing plan and chart, is what am I actually looking at and how this tool can help me. Okay, so now we are looking at the CFGA grazing plan. So this is a template that they have available on their website. Earlier in the year, we did at other meetings where we looked at the herd plan and carrying capacity. So tonight I'm just going to quickly go over what the grazing plan is, and then what the grazing chart is, and then how we can use it. So there's a lot of information on the screen. As you can see, there are lots of blocks and spaces to put information, and it can be very intimidating to look at. So just to get started, most of the things are not really required, but I have a map of my farm here, and I broke my farm up into 4 similar size paddocks. I'm hoping everybody's seeing the map that I'm showing. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I am cross fencing these paddocks and making a whole bunch of smaller paddocks, but for my grazing plan and chart, I'm just using these 4 as paddocks. So you can see I list my paddocks here. Now, if you have the size, that's fine, but that's not needed, or the type. The biggest thing is the day that they start in and the day that they start out. Okay, so in my plan at the beginning of the year, I guessed that I knew my animals were going to start on May 8th, and then I just guessed each paddock roughly how long that I thought that they would be in there. And then I did that for a second rotation, a third rotation, and then a fourth rotation. So don't worry about trying to be right. You're definitely not going to be right. Just put some days in there that you think will be close, and just get started using it. So once you get a plan made out, then you're going to flip over to the chart. And the chart, as you can see if I zoom out here, Sorry, zooming the wrong way. This is a lot of information and a lot of cells that need to be filled out, and definitely looks very daunting, but quite simple to use and make work for you. So you're just going to start with the day that you are on and select the paddock that they're in and highlight that cell black, and just continue to move throughout the year, filling in all the black squares till you get to the day where you're at. Looks like I'm a couple days behind on this one. Okay, so once you start using it, you can see where you are. So I can see, if I go back to my plan, I started May 8th, and I plan to be in that first paddock till May 13th. When I go to my chart, I was actually only in there till May 11th. So right away, I see that I'm a little bit behind schedule, or I'm moving faster than I thought. But as the year continued to go, we get down to, I'm in my second graze here. So my second graze in paddock 3, as you can see here, I thought I was going to be finished that on August 7th. When I go over to my grazing chart, paddock 3, as you can see, that is line number 11, sorry, line number 10. On August 23rd, I am still in paddock 3. So now I am, I'm moving through my farm much slower. So that means I'm going to have a lot more grass at the end of the season than what I had originally planned, if the rest of my plan holds true. Or it could be vice versa. You could be running out of grass quicker than you thought. And you would know that by checking those dates. When did I finish the paddock, and when did I expect to finish the paddock? Okay, then you can start making some decisions or coming up with solutions to solve your problem. So being as right now I have more grass than I thought, I could take on more animals, or I could try and extend my grazing farther, or I could even cut and bale hay on some of my pastures if that was feasible. Now, if it was the opposite problem and you were going to be short, then you would know sooner than most people that aren't using a grazing chart, and you would be able to maybe market some animals sooner before a big glut of animals hit the market when everybody else runs out of pasture. Or you could start supplementing feeding earlier in the season to extend your grazing season. All sorts of options you can do. The biggest thing is you really just have to start using the grazing plan and the grazing chart. Extremely important and very helpful for making decisions. Okay, I'll switch my screens back to my presentation. Sorry. All right, it's going to go back to the beginning here. I'll just flip through my screens. Okay, so now we're going to look at some considerations for grazing cover crops. I've broken this down into 4 topics: feed, water, fencing, and moving. For each topic, I will bring up a list of things you may need to consider before you start grazing cover crops. I am sure I won't cover everything you will need to think about before you start, but hopefully we can get you thinking in the right direction. Okay, so feed. First thing to think about with cover crops is what is in the mix and what nutritional value that will provide to my livestock. Once you know what you have for feed, how much feed is available now and throughout the grazing season. Can I graze it more than once? Assuming cover crops will still be growing while you are there, will there be any change in feed quality while you are grazing? If you are there later in the year, how will frost and snow affect the cover crops? Will the livestock require some sort of feed supplementation while grazing? Or can you extend your grazing by supplying a low-cost feed supplement? If you are going to supplement, how will you do that? Now let's begin to think about what our livestock will require for water. What is our water supply? Will I need to move my water supply while I'm there? How often will I need to move it? If I am moving the water supply, how easily will that be if the weather is not very favorable conditions with snow or even mud? And lastly, how will freezing temperatures affect my water supply? For fencing, the first and easiest question is what will be required to keep my animals in place? Then we will need to know what is already there. And seeing as there are fewer and fewer farms or fields with perimeter fencing, how quickly or easily could you set up a perimeter fence to take advantage of feed? There are lots of new fence supplies that can make setting up and taking down a perimeter fence a lot easier. Then you will also need to consider if there are other areas that the livestock will need to be kept out of, like other crops or bush or even waterways. Then you will need to start considering your portable fencing system and what system will work best for you to move the animals around the field. And while you're thinking about this system, remember to consider how snow and frozen ground will affect that watering or that fencing system. And finally, we will look at some considerations for moving the livestock to the cover crops. First, how will I get my animals on the cover crops? Where is the field and where is the gate? When thinking about getting them to the field, will you need to cross a road? And what help will be required to do so? Or will you need to move livestock down the road? And if so, what kind of road blocks will be required? Or who should I inform before I do so? How much help will I require to do so? And finally, will I need to move them by truck? How and where will I unload them? Now, once you have considered all of that, you will need to make similar considerations for getting your livestock back off the cover crops. And this question becomes really important if you plan to load them back on a truck once you are done. That So I guess that ends my time with you tonight, but I hope I have given you some things to consider because grazing cover crops can really help extend your grazing season and even increase your herd size. And finally, I really hope that I have convinced at least one of you to start using a grazing plan or chart. Thank you for your time, and I will do my best to answer your questions at the end of the meeting.
And now I would like to welcome Birgit, please.
So I'm going to carry on the conversation from Steve about extending the grazing season. I'm going to be talking about first for this immediate time of year, doing some bridging of the season and then extending further into the fall. More specifically, I'll be talking about grazing hay aftermath and some strategies to stockpile pasture. So to preface all this, to be able to bridge or extend the grazing season, you have to have flexibility built into the system. You can't be rigid in your acres or in your layout of your paddocks, for example. There has to be flexibility involved. And secondly, we have to understand that our cool season pasture grasses, the growth curve of them is at odds with livestock demand in our typical grazing season. Growth of our cool season species peaks in the spring, slumps in the summer, and then has a small rebounding in the fall. But that's at odds with our livestock, which are bigger later in the season, bigger calves, bigger lambs, bigger stockers. And so we somehow have to compensate for this irregularity or this incompatibility between growth and demand. So quite simply, we need to add grass into the system or remove stock to deal with the slump in the summer or the slower growth in the fall. I'll touch on adding hay acres here in a minute and stockpiling, but just a few other considerations for matching the growth curve to the demand. You can see that the spring growth curve is quite extreme. And we see that in primarily as we're heading towards our longest day of the year in June. And so we can harvest the excess growth in that time frame to feed out later in the year if necessary. We can fertilize later rather than fertilizing our pastures in early spring. Hold off fertilizing till sometime in June perhaps, so that you're going to push that curve out longer and flatten out perhaps that typical summer slump. And also clip pastures after your first or second rotation. Anything that's mature will not regrow. So if you can clip it off, you're essentially mimicking 100% utilization of that pasture rotation and encourage even regrowth. So again, you'll have more regrowth to bridge the summer slump. Steve has touched on cover crops. You can do crop residue acres in the fall or add warm season species, which are C4 plants. We typically only see corn as an example of a C4 plant, but there are some perennial C4 plants that could be planted, and they then would also have that mid-season peak in growth like corn does. Corn is knee-high the 1st of July roughly, and then 6 to 8 feet tall by the end of July. And C4 plants tend to mimic that kind of growth pattern. So we can introduce some perennial C4 plants into our species mix. This is not commonly done in Ontario, but it's something that we could look toward. And then also have flexibility within your livestock regime of pulling lambs early, pulling calves, sending stockers onto finishing, for example, just to get the livestock out of the system if you can't add acres into the system. Specifically, when we're looking at adding hay acres into the system, take advantage of the portable type of fencing that Steve talked about for grazing cover crops to also graze your hay fields. You can also even bring high legume content hay fields into the rotation. Typically, bloat is of concern, but there are a few strategies to minimize the risk of bloat. Put the livestock in, put the cattle in when the fields are dry and when the cattle are full. Never put them in when they're really hungry or coming off a pasture that was overgrazed, for example. So put the cattle in full and put the cattle into dry fields, and that will minimize bloat risk. Adding the hay fields into the rotation complements the pasture growth cycle because in the spring, pastures do regrow quickly, 20 to 21 days on average, whereas in the fall, it's double that, even triple that. So your hay acres basically are extending the rest time for your pastures. So by adding the hay acres, it gives the pastures full regrowth ability. It helps bridge that summer slump because you can graze hay fields in August instead of pasture fields. And it also might allow you to stockpile extra pasture acres for later. So in terms of stockpiling grass, it's basically just letting pastures rest from July or August onward into late in the season or even into next spring. The quality of this late growth is quite good. The crude protein and the TDN are often better than hay that comes off, mature hay, that is. And in Northern Ontario, there's been some work done that shows you the corresponding crude protein and TDN levels as we go through November and even into April. So in the photographs, you'll see some October pasture with the heifer top left, a group of cows grazing some stockpile pasture with a hard frost on it in November. And the bottom photo is that the growth of new shoots in April, where you're going to see some crude protein levels approaching 12%, TDN 56%, because those new shoots are so nutritious. So don't discount the quality that you could have by resting grass and leaving it into the fall or into the spring even. That being said, there are some species that lend themselves better to stockpiling. The fescues and the bromes maintain their feed quality better later in the fall, as does trefoil. Other species are better in season, but not late. The photograph here shows you some fescue into January. It's a little bit more upright and still green. So the quality is maintained late into the season. But stockpiling is weather dependent. It doesn't always work. This is an example from our farm. All the best intentions did not make stockpiling happen there. In 2018, in June, we had decent growth. Then we had about 6 weeks of no rainfall whatsoever. So that same pasture is just a dry and barren in August, but then we got some rains at the end of August. And with a resilient pasture system that isn't overgrazed, that has some root development underneath it, it can be resilient and rebound. While we were not able to stockpile anything that year, we did get through our regular grazing season with the resilience of the pasture system, of a rotationally grazed system. So stockpiling doesn't always work, but it should be in the plan. And to Steve's point about working with your plan, this is exactly what you can plan for, and then tweak your plan if the weather doesn't cooperate. And just some final comments on stockpiling. Every day that you can graze past whatever your regular pasture window is saves money. In our case, if we can graze past our normal season of May 20th to October 20th, about 150 days, our typical grazing charges are about $200 per cow-calf pair for the season, and hay at $60 a bale. If we can go, every day we go past that season, we're saving basically $1.50 per cow per day. And in this one case with the photograph, you can see that in this one particular year, we were able to graze right through to Christmas on stockpiled pasture. Doesn't happen every year either. But again, in the seasons that do allow it, it is money saved.
Thank you, Birgit. Next, we're going to welcome Joe Dickenson.
I'm going to talk a little bit about bale grazing and some of that warm season grass stockpiling. In my case, it was corn grazing. This photo here that I've got is actually from this year. What's behind my cattle is sorghum, for those wondering. But that's another warm season grass. The only problem is we want to make sure it's off before a frost. But it can really help during that summer slump as well. Okay. So I'm going to start off with bale grazing. The photo here isn't from my farm. Anyone who knows Lambton County will appreciate that. But what it does show is it shows a lot of bales just set out loose. In this case, they're setting those bales out on the round. Personally, I like to set them on the flat myself because it keeps those bales from rolling. So you don't have a calf snuggled up underneath a bale and a cow coming up, rooting the bale and killing the calf. That's not really the goal of our industry. When I put the bales on the end, what I've found is it provides a little bit of a nest and a bit of a windbreak, as well as providing feeder space. So how did I start? I started with a system very similar to this. My biggest goal was I wanted to limit space, but by limiting space, I was using feeders. When you're using feeders, you have limited feeder space. And doing some quick math, to buy a new feeder works out roughly to about $35 per spot on a feeder like this. But the reality is, as we're later in the season, a lot of times those cows are heavy in calf, and you're not going to be using all those holes. So it's probably going to work out to a space for every 2 spaces for every cow. And so if you're buying a feeder, that cost for the year is going to be an extra $70 per feeder space. So that's one cost that you have to factor in. That said, I found a few things when I did it this way. First off, I found racetracks. And some of you may wonder what I'm talking about by this. But basically, when you set a bale feeder out in the pasture, and if you're not able to move it, the area around that bale feeder is going to get beaten down until it's a track. And once that track gets beaten down, that track's going to provide a spot where in rain, the water's going to sit, it's going to become muddy, and it's going to be a moat. And if it's dry, it's going to be bare, it's going to be a dirt track all the way around that bale feeder. And that's what I'm referring to as a racetrack. When that becomes a moat, then you run into problems 2 and 3. You have stuck calves and stuck feeders. Stuck calves is obviously the biggest problem because they've come in to get a drink or to get out of the weather or to find a dry spot to lay down, and they've gotten stuck in the mud that's around those bale feeders. The other thing that happens, so you say move the feeders, that doesn't work if the animals are already congregating by the gate or by your feeder as soon as you're trying to come in with a bale. As a result, generally one feeder is going to stay while you take care of the other one. And when you get into wintertime, those feeders are going to be a lot harder to move. So in the spring, I noticed that I'd had a couple spots that had been stripped clear of topsoil by a previous owner. And when I had to be away for a full day, I couldn't go out and feed twice a day. So I'd set bales on that bare patch of clay. And over a couple years, that bare patch of clay became a really nice little piece of pasture. I also noticed that in the spring and throughout the summer, where those feeders had sat, there was some nice bright green circles, and that led to me having a bit of a mental shift. Now, the biggest thing that changed my mind was when I realized that, yes, we want to make sure that there's lots of feed into our cattle, but we also have to take care of our ground. And anytime that we're leaving feed or manure or straw on the ground, we're feeding that ground. And as a result, I decided one year to just get rid of the feeders entirely. And I'd just go out and set the bales wherever I could set them. I got rid of the racetracks overnight. I was able to provide as many bales as I needed for the day when I was setting out those bales. Those bales also provided a nest for calves in cold, wet weather, and it helped to spread out the herd more and help give back to that soil. And so here's an example of doing this. In 2020, I cleared 30 acres of hawthorn trees. The picture on the left is actually in the fall after we'd cleared those trees. And you can see there's not a lot of feed there to begin with because the trees had killed out everything below them. And so we started putting bales out where we noticed the low spots, where we noticed hawthorns, where we noticed Canada thistle. We'd set the bales there. And what happened was the cows started to work that area up really, really nicely. And what what absolutely blew me away and floored me was in July when I went and looked um, at this picture the following year, and I'm setting up step-in posts, and I think the picture on the left was from late August. The picture on the right was from mid-July, the following year, and it was just mind-blowing at how much we'd been able to help improve that soil structure, even just over the course of a year. Not having the hawthorns there to kill out what was underneath helped as well, but it was definitely a combination of both. And I was really impressed with the improvement that we saw there. And so at the new place, that's something that's going to happen this winter as well, because we really don't have a lot of organic matter in this area. There is tech available out there to help roll out bales. And I know lots of people who love rolling out the bales because they find that they can feed more animals with less fighting. And I'm certainly not going to attack anybody for that. I've seen it work really well. We used a truck mounted system when I was in Saskatchewan, and it works incredibly well. It really depends on what you're trying to do on your farm, whether you want to go the route of rolling out bales or whether you want to set them in strategic areas and move those strategic areas around. So the next thing that I'll talk about briefly was my experience with grazing corn. Again, these are not my cattle, but this does look fairly similar to what we were seeing. We see them clip it down a little bit further even. And so this happened in, I believe it was 2023. I'd heard of a few guys doing grazing corn and I'd wanted to try it. I planted a 12-acre field straight behind the barn, and that year my silo and loader broke. We made an emergency bunk. It got full because it didn't have the storage capacity of the silo. And with all the costs and the setup and everything else, I said, I don't own oil stock. Why am I doing this extra work when I've wanted to try grazing anyhow? And we can save a lot of fuel, we can save the plastic cost, and we can see how this works. And so what I did, this is my field back then. You can see where I've punched through it with the four-wheeler, and that's what we'd do. We'd measure out what the animals needed for a day. We'd punch through it with the four-wheeler. We'd set up a line of like one of those reels, and we'd have a bale of hay off to the side so that we could help the animals prevent any risk of acidosis, and that sort of thing, as well as providing a safe spot for those animals that didn't want to go into the corn. I certainly would do it again in the right opportunity. But one thing that we'll be doing differently moving forward, going back to what Birgit was talking about, was we're going to be using the e-shepherd collars for bale grazing and corn, and if we do corn grazing down the road, simply because those tools will give us a little bit more flexibility as we move forward.
And now I'm going to welcome Chris Moore to join us.
Hey, man, it sucks going after all these great presenters. Thanks for Patricia and Rebecca for putting this on. Kind of a timely thing, I think, trying to get through some extended dry season and set ourselves up for a successful fall and a great winter. Gonna kind of talk about like when things aren't going great, and I kind of feel for a lot of people in this province right now that are really struggling with some dry conditions. We dealt with that in 2012 and have been basically preparing for it ever since. And I guess next slide. So I'm a partner here at Shady Creek Lamb, and we do stuff pretty different. And basically, it has to do with that drought back in 2012. It left a pretty lasting impression, and I didn't want to do that again. So it set us up doing some silvo pasture, which I don't get to do very much of anymore until like ram lambs come home weaned. But that's like where you're grazing woodlots and using livestock to help manage the woodlots. So I got started in 2012 because I was going to the bush every day to cut a tank full of gas through the chainsaw to feed the leaves of the sheep. And feeding leaves doesn't sound like a great idea until it's the only thing you could do. When we compare 2012 to today's prices, corn's very cheap these days, and livestock is through the roof. The average price for drop calves in Ontario in 2012 was $20 to $200, and corn was like I think it was 277 a ton. Picked up in like in the farmer's yard kind of deal. So goes to the mill, gets to be more expensive, and then when it gets delivered to you, it's even more expensive. So as far as that's concerned, I think we're dealing with a dry spell at a very good time as a livestock producer. And we normally graze our ewe flock off their home farm, and it's made it so that we can be very flexible with our grazing. So we graze solar sites, and all of our grazing infrastructure is portable. So our water tanks, fencing, livestock, and handling facilities. So we've added a livestock chute, and we work with commercial haulers to move our sheep around so we don't have to own trailers or do paperwork. Slide, please. Be willing to do what others aren't. And sometimes that means going to your neighbors and saying, hey, your winter wheat's off. Can we plant oats and peas? And if you don't ask, the answer is always going to be no. Same like going and asking if you can graze their corn stalks, because that's a pretty good resource, just the corn stalks. If you have a neighbor that has a John Deere combine with a case corn head, that is excellent potential for extra feed all fall long. And I like getting our livestock onto cover crops and crop aftermath as soon in the season as we can, that we are stockpiling our hay fields and pastures for like once they've gone dormant, because I don't want to beat them up, especially in a year like this, worse than they already are. Slide, please. So planning for drought is using other people's ground, so we get to stockpile as much as what we have here at home. That is like, it's a lot more work to graze, so I don't graze it every year. When I need it, I've got it. I want to act fast. If you get offered a field of soybeans that's standing, but they're not going to make it, and crop insurance is wrote it off, or the farmer doesn't have crop insurance and just wants to get winter wheat in, don't blink, get them in there. If the crop is in that condition, it's probably just going to go backwards, and the farmer might change his mind. So act fast, grab that feed. Same with doing the leaves thing. Like trees will shed their leaves when they're stressed, and fall is coming. So you can't sit on that, silvo pasture, like setting up for silvo pasture. You can't sit on that opportunity to cut those hawthorns and feed them to your livestock. Graze what others won't, ditches and stuff like that. That's not always a great option, but it is an option, especially when you're in tough conditions. The trees, again, it's not ideal until it is. The solar has been an amazing opportunity for our family, and cover crops, I think, are just the greatest thing. I love working with our neighboring cash croppers that care about soil health. They want to improve their yields and build resiliency in their soil by having livestock manure, but don't want the responsibility of having livestock. So that's been really good for us too. And then crop aftermath, I want to do corn stalks more this year because we're not using nets anymore for fencing. And even get into soybean stubble because we see deer following combines and they just never seem to leave those soybean fields. So there's got to be something there. So I'd like to try that. And then woodlots is another kind of like last opportunity. Drought proofing the farm starts now. Last week got to tour a farm and they're using some of those native species grasses that I think Birgit was talking about, that they're like that C4 that they kind of peak later in the season, and it was I was pretty impressed. I hadn't seen anything like that before, but definitely has my wheels turning. Slide please. Oh, when you get into these extended dry periods, I hate calling them droughts because we have friends that live on the prairies and they've gone 3 years without measurable rain, so, or moisture, I should say. So in Ontario, I think we can get a 4-week dry period and call it a drought, and I know it feels like one, but when you set yourself up for success, it doesn't hurt as bad. But the first thing I want to do when I notice my pasture's starting to look tough is I want to cull use. Get those, I don't know if they're freeloaders or higher maintenance animals, the flock as quick as I can. And again, it's acting fast on that. The second I notice my pasture's not looking like they should, the sooner I can get them out, the better. That means the feed that is there is for my animals that are going to make me a profit later. It means like I'm acting fast. So if I wait till the end of the drought and everybody's called their flocks, the price is going to be in the tank. And I've burnt up all my feed, so even my good ones don't have anything good. You know what I mean? So acting fast, get rid of those calls, improves the forage quality for the rest of the good animals, and it'll cash flow better so you can make better decisions later on. I like moving animals to feed and not feed to animals. A lot of our feed that we feed has a lot of moisture. I don't like trucking that around. I prefer loading sheep on trucks and having them walk and harvest their own feed. I find that just so much easier and more enjoyable. Working with good commercial haulers that are responsible and knowledgeable makes a big difference. Also, incredible drivers to get into some of these tight spots. We do have the infrastructure already to be doing this all mobile and portable, so that really helps. But there might be other people in your neighborhood that also have similar setups. So instead of thinking you have to go buy all your own equipment, hiring other people is a really good option, and you get to write it off when you contract people. So we write off our truckers. We do help other people load and ship their sheep with our infrastructure, and I mean, it helps us pay for our equipment and it helps them too, right? So it's a good option to hire other people that are knowledgeable. Slide, please. Oh, having your livestock fence trained, which I wouldn't think I'd have to mention to this group, but maybe it's important to be aware of, as making sure your animals are fence trained. So when your animals are fence trained, it means, you can push them a little bit harder, so they can take on those invasive species or undesirables and tramp them at least into the ground. I don't like to mow. That's kind of why I graze, it because I don't like being in tractors. Not that I don't all the time. It's just I don't like to have to be committed to it. So I don't like to drive tractors. So we graze and try and just, we don't want to push our animals too hard, but get that pressure that we can take out those species we don't like. And then we also find, like, we have what we call hard nosed sheep, and I got these weaned lambs and put them out to an alfalfa field, and they're picking at the edges of the field because that's kind of what they're used to. And so it's kind of nice to have animals like that, and we don't want animals tangled in fences, and we don't want them going through fences and getting into real trouble. Slide, please. Coming back to that, getting the corn into them. 2012, like it was crazy. Like a ton of corn costed more than a cull ewe was worth, or a good ewe for that matter. So I think we're in a really good shape this fall with the price of grain that we can use it to supplement, to stretch our pastures, to keep our animals performing better. I know it's a forage group, but I think there is a role for grain in certain situations. It also helps speed up like your growth rates. So in our example, we're feeding ram lambs and they're on third cut alfalfa, and with that, getting that whole grain corn to them, hopefully we can get them out the door sooner than later and make sure our pastures get rested better because there's less animals on them, and we can like just have less pressure on our forage supply for the rest of the winter because we're getting these animals gone sooner. I hope it doesn't hurt the price when we sell, but at the same time, I want to get as many pounds out the door as I can, as quick as I can. Um, it's not always like knowing your math on that kind of stuff is always important too. That just because I said it today that you should be feeding corn doesn't mean you should do it for always. Being aware of opportunities, I think, is really important, and costs of stuff too. And yeah, so I guess slide, please. Thinking long term. Yeah, so I want to make sure I get the critical rest periods on my hay fields and pastures. Um, so for us, that's pulling them and getting them on cover crops and crop aftermath as soon as we can. We know the critical rest period for alfalfa going into winter. I think maybe trefoil too. We're getting close to alfalfas right now in our area, at least. I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume all of our pasture desirable species have critical rest periods. There's just not a lot of money to do the research to figure out what, you know, the different clovers and grasses, what their critical rest period is. But I think the better we can rest them going into winter, the better, because I don't think we want to have a whole bunch of winter kill next year because we beat up our pastures in the fall. So getting a bit of fertilizer out there sets them up for success a whole lot better. I don't want to be frost eating in the spring. So I think keeping the pasture species that we want there already there, I think is really important. I mean, I think I used to be a prime minister the way I say sometimes. Getting some fertilizer this year on the cover crops, I think, is going to be a lot of benefit too. Some of them a little slow coming out of the ground. That getting that extra little bit of fertility to them just help. Was it an agronomist thing the other day, and they were saying about how you got to put your money into the muscle of your crop and get it across that finish line. And it's a bit of a generic statement, but I think it does hold true to some things. And if you've got a decent looking stand, a cover crop, but it could use a little extra, I think it's definitely worth getting that in there. I'd rather save my hay fields and pasture fields for early next spring or really late in the fall after they've basically gone dormant. And I'm not beating them up too much this fall. And that RAPA fencing system, I think, is a great way to take advantage of this. If anybody's interested, let me know. That's our contact info, and I guess we're taking questions at the end. The one thing I would say is very true, and it says it there, is make sure you get like people around you that make good decisions and try and provide value for them and be able to talk to them about certain things before you try them. Just as a bit of a stress test, and you want to have make sure you have people that kind of know what they're doing, not just guessing, and are pretty honest. So I think that's an important little thing to have.